Hello, and welcome back to today's American Flyer Trains for the rebuild of 4745 Rocket, 4745 Rocket, a double-A pair of Alco PA units sold from 1953 to 1955. This video is the first of two post-rebuild videos. Just going to highlight a few things in this video about the rebuild, and then in a following video, which you should also find on my YouTube channel, Days of Trains, there'll be some static photography of the rebuild process and also the railhead test. The 474 unit has two motors, each with pull-more wheels. Has the traditional 4-position reverse unit. The 475 dummy unit housed the sound generator, which is still operational on this train. Both of these units are illuminated, and they are considered by Doyle to be Type 1. They have a build date stamp of August of 1953, and as you can see, they are chrome-plated, and according to Doyle, have a scarcity rating of 5 on a scale of 1 to 8. One of their most unique features is, in comparison to their build date of 1953, they still have the saw marks where they have cut out pilots. That is, these bodies were probably made initially for the 1950 Santa Fe PA units, Alco PA units, and I think it's really interesting that these bodies could have lasted possibly from 1950 or 51 all the way to 1953 in A.C. Gilbert's part supply. And as we know, A.C. Gilbert was the master of repurposing parts and moving them forward in the life cycle of his trains to make sure all parts inventory were used. Those saw marks are easily visible on both of these units. This is the dummy unit, and these are the saw marks. You can see the striations here, and you can also see them here, where they were cut out from the 1950 supply of Alco diesel shells. Sometimes you can see red paint on the interior of these, as I demonstrated on another rebuild for a customer, in which they were clearly then repainted, having originally been painted red. I could not see, upon disassembly and rebuild, any indication of red paint, but clearly these are cut out pilots. I'm just surprised that the bodies lasted in the supply inventory on into 1953. Before continuing, just a little housekeeping note. I'm not using my regular microphone because I had to suddenly put my camera on charge, hook it up to power. So I apologize that maybe the sound is not as clear as it normally is. But before I just highlight a few things about the beginning of this rebuild, a couple of words about solvents used to clean these trains. Recently in articles, I've seen mention of a wide variety of solvents, even lighter fluid. I thought I'd seen it all until I saw that. I believe and stand by that I still think the best solvents to use on these trains, that is the metal parts, not the plastic, is 91% alcohol or mineral spirits, which are rated with no residue. And therein is the key, is the residue. A lot of solvents leave residue, and yes, that includes CRC 226, one of my favorite. If you put these solvents onto, say, a railhead or contact wheels, you run the chance that that solvent is going to get burned off and create additional carbon burn that you normally would not have if your railhead or contact wheels were cleaned with something that leaves no solvent. Now, how do you find out if it leaves a solvent? Well, sometimes it says right on the label. As a matter of fact, I think the CRC contact cleaner states on the label that it is a no residue solvent. CRC 226, however, is a residue solvent, and you will leave a residue which could increase the carbon type burn. CRC contact cleaner, as I said, has a label that says leaves no residue. However, be careful, it is not plastic compatible. It can damage plastic and its surfaces. CRC 226 is a lubrication that enhances electrical properties, and it is plastic safe. As a matter of fact, I've used it on some pieces simply to restore a little bit of luster to the plastic finish when I really wanted to leave the original plastic coloration. I think it's ideal for reverse unit drums, fingers, the reverse unit pawl, that is the mechanism that sends the plate up and down on the reverse unit. It is not for solenoids. Solenoids, and I got asked this question very recently, the plunger in solenoids nor the tube in a solenoid, while they should be thoroughly cleaned, and removed from any type of residue, and they should be polished and should be wiped down with alcohol. They should not be lubricated. They're not intended for lubrication. I would not use CRC 26 on track surfaces or on pickup wheels or slide contacts. Now, yes, I think I started out very early 5 years ago doing that, but I think I paid the price, and I think I have corrected that with railhead and pickup wheels, which last a pretty good while on my layout, operational hours, without leaving much residue or producing a lot of carbon. Finally, I think the best lubricant, overall lubricant for reducing friction or on friction points is Gear Lube. Now, I have two different brands. This one was recommended by a Lionel dealer who was in business 40 to 45 years, who strongly believed in this because of its higher viscosity and highly recommended it. With higher viscosity, as you know, it's going to be thicker, it's less likely to be slung on the railhead, and it's less likely to end up being slung on places like commutators. These two pieces were basically standard rebuilds using a particular framework that I've adopted over the years, and that is a complete disassembly, thorough washing with a degreasing green or blue soap, with a medium to hard nylon type brush, like a toothbrush is one example. However, with those, be careful of using them on shiny painted surfaces, or over water slide decals, or over pressed on lettering or dry rubs. Be careful, they can remove those. Then I polish metal parts using a rotary tool on low RPM, low to medium RPM, and then do a final alcohol wipe. Again, I lubricate the high RPM friction points with this Gear Lube, places like axle bushings and armature bearings. Now, there's other places that have no danger probably of dropping or slinging. Those might be okay with the lower viscosity, like your 3-in-1 oils. But for trucks, axles, bearings, and bushings, I highly recommend the Gear Lube. First, the 475 PA dummy unit. It's been completely rebuilt. I'm very pleased with its outcome. It looks almost brand new, as much as it possibly can. All contact wheels have been thoroughly cleaned and polished and removed of any residue. And then the high friction points, such as the bushings with the axles against the trucks, have been lubricated with Gear lubricant or Gear oil. I found in this unit an unconventional long globe bulb. I don't think this was what came with the train. I think it was inserted later. Looks like something that maybe was acquired at a hardware store in the 1950s or 60s. It's just a guess. The other thing I found interesting could have been the result of a factory flaw, or it could have been the result of somebody else doing maintenance on this, is that the headlight lens was incorrectly positioned, meaning it had been rotated 180 degrees. Now, normally the collector surface of these lenses sits at a 45-degree angle in this relationship. The bulb's down here, the light comes up, it's collected by this plate, this surface at 45 degrees, and then transmitted out the lens. This lens had been rotated 180 degrees such that the collector plate was sitting up, facing upward like this instead of down toward the bulb. Well, all I had to do was pop it out, rotate it, and get that back into a more acceptable. I also found on this piece, as I did the power unit, is that the side truck, or the side frames on the trucks were rotating at the contact points here and here along the axis of the truck, which means these plates, or excuse me, these side frames were rotating like this. They were pivoting on these contact points. This isn't the first time I found this, but why I even noticed that it was a problem, possible problem, is that I found one of these wheels, I don't remember which truck it was, one of these wheels that had a clear collection of arcing divots on the exterior of the wheel where electricity had arced against it. And then I found on the interior of the side frame comparable arc marks itself, which means as these rotated down, they may have been touching the wheel, or even rotated up for that matter, thus causing that arc. It really wouldn't be a short because all of this is in the circuit, but it's just an unnecessary phenomenon that's not needed. So I rebonded them at the contact points with a 24-hour drying period. Is what I have found works well to hopefully prevent that, probably just from being picked up a lot with the trucks. Another item I found is that there was practically no tension, and just like with the arc marks on these side frames, being found also on the power unit, I also found on both units that the slide or shoe contacts did not have enough spring tension. As a matter of fact, they had no spring tension. They were just freely floating and hanging down, which I don't think is a good model to have for an electrical contact point. Why it was doing that is because the spring inside the shoe was compressed. So I removed the shoe, refashioned the spring, reinserted it, put the shoe back in after cleaning and polishing, and then we get this nice tension that always pushes the slide or shoe contact down to the contact surface. A shoe box and a shoe from my parts supply to demonstrate how I remove those. I'll take a very small screwdriver and apply pressure at that tab right there, the tab that keeps the shoe from coming out. And I'll apply just enough pressure with the shoe being put down on a good hard soft surface, or firm soft surface, until the tab goes behind the shoe box, like that. Then I take my needle nose and grasp it here on the sides very gently. I don't overexert pressure because you can collapse these slide contacts, and then you're in the game of having to re-tension them as far as how far to spread them apart. And I put a slight amount of pressure until I can wiggle this completely out. I cleaned the shoe thoroughly, and then the shoe box thoroughly, interior and exterior, and then I retension and restretch the spring. Now this is a brand new one. There is a trick to getting these back in. Don't drop the spring into the shoe box and then try to force the slide contact back down on top of it. You run the risk that you're going to get the spring tangled up on the edge of the shoe, of the slide contact. What I found works best is to go ahead and press the spring into the slide contact, like this, and then insert it. Again, the same thing applies. Go backwards. Push it down until the tab hits the top of the box. Then use your needle nose pliers to get the tab to disappear. Again, gentle pressure until you get it down until it clicks in place and the tab holds the slide contact in. Now this one didn't turn out too neat with the spring, but I think you get the idea that the spring needs to go in first with it firmly against the top of the slide contact, and not the opposite. Don't put the spring in and then try to force this on top of the spring and on into this. Now, during this whole process, you want to protect this as much as possible from it coming unbonded with these centered iron side frames, because they're molded into these centered iron side frames. However, I've had good results in using JB Weld and a crazy glue to hold these in place very satisfactorily over time, if in fact they do break loose from the bonding with the die-cast metal. In rebuilding 474, the power unit, I found that on both ends of both motors in the motor chassis, that the thrust plates had very large dimples in them, but no penetration. Now that means that the thrust was elongated more than it normally should be, probably. What I did was I took them both out, inspected them to make sure there was no penetration cleanly through the thrust plate, which I have seen before. I turned one of the thrust plates around to the smooth side, reinserted it, reinserted the other thrust plate in the reverse direction, the one that has the pressure in the reverse direction, and then dropped the armature back in to make sure that I had a little bit of thrust movement backwards and forwards, and then let it go at that. So I found that in both of these. I found that the brushes on one of these motors to the commutator were far too short, which means the tension simply wasn't what it should be. I also found that one of the brushes had become removed from the brass brush holder. Now when I took the bottom plate off of the truck, it just fell out. So what I replaced both of them with, in order to maintain even pressure, were brand new reproductions that I obtained from Portland's. And these work very, very well. Just be careful soldering them. You want to tint these and the wires again, although the wires should probably be tinted, but you want to clean these thoroughly up here on this end and then retint them prior to putting them back in and making the final connection. But they work very satisfactorily. I found that there was carbon dust, extensive carbon dust in the slots on both armatures, on the commutator. Make sure that those are cleaned. I prefer a toothpick, something that's wooden and something that's very sharp, and I even soak the end of the toothpick in alcohol prior to pushing that carbon dust out. I found that the Pullmore wheels were very hard and slick, but they both had the insulator intact. So this insulator can be repurposed. There's no reason to toss these. These vulcanized wheels, it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to get them resurfaced. So what I did was I replaced them with Portland's grooved wheels that I've had a lot of good results with on all of my diesels. I've replaced all of mine. And there's one right there. You can see that the pull-more tire part of this sits in a slot, which I think gives it better, structural ability to not slide off. And I have just had great results in improved tractive force or pull when using these. And there's the other one down there. As you can see, the power unit cleaned up very nicely, completely rebuilt inside and out. Now, one of the pull-more wheels I discovered prior to disassembly, the plastic insulator had pulled out, and it was rubbing up against the motor chassis. Matter of fact, it was applying pressure. It was applying so much pressure that it had pulled out as far as it could go, and the axle could no longer move in and out at all. It was very tight up against the chassis, which then put the gear in a fixed position where it could not move. So in order to get this back into place, I pressed a new one. I took the wheel off, the one that was doing that, and it was one of these right here. It was one of the non-pull-more wheels. And I'll show you how I did that on a vice grip. This is an Irwin steel vice grip that has the 3 axle points, which keeps it straight, keeps the head from moving. I used to use a wooden one, but I found that the wooden ones simply would not match up parallel nearly as well as the steel. It also has an anvil right here, which I find to be very handy. And that's how I squeeze those insulators into the wheels. Now, in order to get them started, I simply soak the insulator in warm to hot water for about 5 minutes. Take it out, quickly towel dry it, spray the interior with a little bit of canned air, and then I can actually get it started into the wheel by pushing it in with my thumb. Then I place it in the vice grips, and I get the straight 90-degree pressing of it into the wheel itself. I also use this to press the wheels on the axles, both for steams and diesels. It works extremely well for maintaining the square 90-degree relationship of the wheel to the axle. This is a little bit of an unconventional way, to say the least, of showing this to you, but it's all I have left considering the train has already been reassembled, and that's its still photography. When I disassembled one of the motors, I think it was the rear one, the worm gear just simply fell out of the motor, as did the bearing, which you would expect because it is not affixed to the shaft of the armature. Both just fell out freely. After consulting with a nearby engineer who is also an American Flyer collector and hobbyist and rebuilder, I did this. Of course, I thoroughly cleaned this whole device. I'll show you an after picture shortly. I then repositioned the bearing all the way down and taped it to the shaft to get it out of the way. I made sure that the worm gear could move freely up and down, took it back off. Then, just to hold it, because I needed that third hand, I put a couple of drops of crazy glue on the shaft. Then I slid and repositioned, and I practiced this several times without the glue to make sure I knew exactly how far I wanted to insert this worm gear down the shaft. Now, it didn't take long for that. When I say didn't take long, I'm talking about from 3 to 5 seconds for that crazy glue to grip and then fix this. But I got it in the right position. Now, with the crazy glue holding it for me, and with this the bearing out of the way, I was able then to work with the tip end and do the soldering that needed to be done to solder the worm gear to the shaft. And it actually turned out to be pretty easy. But of course, tinting the end of the worm gear helped a lot. This photograph shows the armature, the bearing, and the worm gear after all were thoroughly cleaned. And of course, I didn't attempt the bonding until all surfaces were clean. I mentioned that this was kind of a standard rebuild, and maybe there is one area of the rebuild that exceeded my expectations for what I was going to have to perform, and maybe has set a record, and that is the amount of grease that was compressed into these gearboxes. I haven't even finished this when I took the photograph to show the amount of grease that came off on the paper towel that I'd scraped out of here. The before shot of the armature, and there's the after shot of some key components prior to affixing the worm gear to the shaft. I do not have a photograph of that after it was done, but of course it's going to look exactly like this end right here. Oops. This is the degree to which I think it should be cleaned. There's the chassis, the new wheel with the slotted pull-more. the interior of the gearboxes or gear cavity, bottom, close up, and there's the entire inventory of parts, I think, for that motor. That's the degree that I think they need to be cleaned and polished prior to reassembly, and I've had very good results of getting them to this state, rebuilding them with proper lubrication, and they operate exactly as they were, almost as if they were new. That's kind of the summation of the kickoff to the rebuild, or actually the results of the rebuild of the 475 PA pair, 474, 475, 1953. Appreciate your watching. Look forward to your comments and replies, and stay tuned. There should be a video soon following this which has some still photography during the rebuild process and then the final railhead test. Thanks again for watching Dave's American Flyer Trains. So long, everyone.